up on the screen before. Susan has no idea what I'm going to say about them or how long it's going to take me to do it. So this should be an interesting, if the first, type of program. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Thomas Long, Collingwood's forgotten man. Maybe I should put my glasses on. See a little bit better. It's said that you shouldn't believe everything you read in the newspapers. But what if they printed comments like these? Prominent in the early development of Collingwood, founder of our most important industries, few men knew Collingwood better, big factor in Collingwood's progress, Collingwood's foremost citizen. Surely these quotes can't all be wrong. The recipient of such high praise was Thomas Long. Thomas Long was born in County Limerick, Ireland in 1836. His native land was devastated by the Great Famine of the 1840s, and many people fled to North America in search of a better life. In 1850, young Tom joined this exodus and ended up employed as a store clerk in Ottawa. In 1854, Tom's employers, Melville and Buse, put him in charge of their newly opened branch store in Collingwood. Thus began Thomas Long's involvement with the town, and for the next 60 years, he was to play a prominent role in every aspect of its development. Quote, one of the principal movers in building up Collingwood. Collingwood at that time has been described as a dismal cedar swamp, but Tom saw his future in such an unattractive site and managed to save $200 from his meager wages. This capital enabled him to open his own store in 1858. His business prospered, and in 1866 he was joined in partnership with a younger brother, John, and the firm became known as T. Long and Brother. Quote, T. Long and Brother was one of the largest and most enterprising wholesale and retail firms north of Toronto. Interesting that the firm was T. Long and Brother rather than Long Brothers. John was the quiet partner, deeply involved in all business endeavors, but it was Tom who was the spokesman. One wag suggested that John did all the work and Tom took all the credit. John had joined Tom in Ottawa, later went to Buffalo and Toronto, married and became a widower 3 years later. He then joined Tom in Collingwood and remained here until his tragic death in 1904. Quote, John Long was always loyal to the town. Its progress and prosperity were due in no small degree to his business ability. And there's their ad from 1866. They carried quite a variety of things in the store. And there is the store. By the 1870, the brothers were conducting business in a 4-story brick building on the east side of Huron-Ontario Street, between Huron and Simcoe Streets. Quote, Mr. Long has always taken the lead in all local enterprises carried on with a view of developing the town of Collingwood. Here's a view of Huron-Ontario Street looking north in the late 1870s. Note the trees and the commanding appearance of Long's store compared to the other buildings. Sadly, this imposing structure was totally destroyed in the Great Fire of 1881, which wiped out the east side of the street. However, Long's had already commenced building a block of brick stores across the street. Fire also struck them twice, but after each disaster, they rebuilt on an even larger scale, and so continued to contribute significantly to the economy of Collingwood and the surrounding area. Here's a picture of the 1892 male employees. Of course, there were female employees also, since there were millinery and dressmaking departments, and women also worked in the office. Maybe the women were too modest about having their pictures taken. I had 7 relatives I know of who were long employees. When one married, she was given a silver tea service and 12 sterling silver spoons, so they were generous employers. John Long was her godfather and left her a generous bequest in his will. Her sister, upon leaving the firm to care for their ailing mother, was given a ring with 2 diamonds and a substantial check. Their brother, who was Tom's godson, left the firm to start his own store on Huron Street, but alas, it soon burnt down. Quote, obliging and efficient staff of clerks are always on hand to cater to the requirements of patrons. Long's was wholesale as well as a retail business, thus a warehouse. The caption says the site of the Bank of Toronto in 1912. Quote, Thomas Long's enterprise and determination to succeed has been rewarded by success, and the people of Collingwood and the surrounding country have also profited by prosperity. Here are the stores on the west side of Ontario Street in the early 1900s. Described as the largest department store north of Toronto, Long's claimed to have purchased more produce from farmers than any other firm in Ontario. They went out of the retail business in 1906, and the stores were leased or sold to other firms. In the devastating fire of January 1953, Faith's and Foley's furniture stores were destroyed. What was left, minus the 3rd floor, held on until a few years ago when they were demolished to make way for Loblaw's expanded parking lot. Thus ended the last vestige of T. Long and Brother on Ontario Street. Quote, most extensive general store north of Toronto. I think that's a remarkable picture showing what Collingwood's main street on the west side between 1st and 2nd looked like in the 1900s. Now, that's just a parking lot. Progress? I don't think so. An interior view of the store, probably the grocery department, since the caption identifies the gentleman on the left as Joseph Collins and the one on the right as Michael Brophy. At Thomas Long's funeral, both men served as pallbearers and were still employees. Mr. Collins as director and accountant, and Mr. Brophy as sales manager. The caption states that the cages on the right were tellers' cages. There is a Royal Bank sign on one. What, did they have a bank in there? I don't know. The exterior view of the grocery department. The gentlemen on the left and center were Thomas and Michael Patrick, always known as MP, Burns, nephews of the Long brothers. The Burns boys were sons of Mary Long and her husband John Burns, who had also settled in Collingwood. There are still Burns descendants in town. The gentleman on the right was Michael Brophy, the head of the grocery department. He also has descendants in town. MP Burns and Michael Brophy were to serve as pallbearers for Thomas Long many years in the future. Thomas Burns worked as an accountant for his uncles and had been in charge of the Thornbury and Stainer branch stores. But then he married a young lady from Buffalo and spent the rest of his life working in the City of Buffalo accounting department. The young lady was my cousin. As previously noted, Long's closed the retail part of their business in 1906 and concentrated on the wholesale aspect. This necessitated building a larger warehouse on the corner of Pine and First Streets. In 1928, Long's and other local firms amalgamated with National Grocers, and this building became their local headquarters. It was demolished to make way for Woolworth's new store, and the site is now the parking lot for the liquor store. That and a parking lot, progress. Quote, a long career of honorable dealing has given the wholesale department of this firm a wide and enviable position. Another venture was the Collingwood Meatpacking Company, which was formed in 1894 by 3 local firms, Longs, Stevens, and Telfors, who decided it was more advantageous to amalgamate than to compete. The plant catered mainly to the export trade, with Collingwood bacon being a much appreciated delicacy in Great Britain. The firm claimed to have paid more than $2 million to local farmers for hogs in 1902. They even called the train the hog special. It brought so many hogs into town. Longs disposed of their interest in 1904. The others carried on until the firm went bankrupt in 1913. The magnificent building was destroyed by fire 3 years later. It was located on the western outskirts of town, near the site of the now demolished Kaufman plant. Quote, Thomas Long was for many years president of the Meatpacking Company, which did such a large business and proved such a great asset to the business life of the town. Longs had a thriving wholesale as well as a retail business. In the 1870s, the north and northeast shores of Georgian Bay were being opened up by extensive lumbering operations. Since this area could only be reached by water, Longs first leased a boat, then bought one, then bought into a shipping line, which later became the Great Northern Transit Company, and still later, the Northern Navigation Company. The above steamer, the Majestic, built in 1895, was the pride of the Great Northern Transit Company. And that's a picture of it here at the dock. Quote, Thomas Long was an outstanding pioneer in water transportation on the Great Lakes. Here's the dining room of the Majestic. This beautiful wooden steamer was furnished by T. Long and Brother. Why not? After all, the brothers were directors of the shipping line that owned it. Here's the steamer Germanic, which was built in 1899 for the Northern Navigation Company. I found while perusing the old newspapers that my grandfather, who was an employee of T. Long and Brother, took a cruise on this steamer in 1901 and my mother in 1913. Although both Long brothers were longtime officials of shipping lines, it was always Tom who was lauded as being the pioneer in Great Lakes transportation. Quote, Thomas Long greatly helped to promote the lake trade. With so many steamers plying the Great Lakes, there had to be facilities for building and repairing them. Collingwood had the Queen's Dry Dock, built in 1883, but by 1889 its owners were bankrupt and the town had fallen heir to a decrepit facility. Oh, what to do? In stepped the Long brothers and 2 partners, Charles Cameron and Captain Peter Black Pete Campbell, with an offer to repair and operate the dry dock in return for tax concessions. The town accepted their offer, and thus was born our largest and best-known industry, the Collingwood Shipyard, which remained in operation until 1986. The venture was successful beyond its founder's wildest dreams and produced such magnificent wooden steamers as the previously shown Majestic in 1895 for the Great Northern Transit Company and the Germanic in 1899 for the Northern Navigation Company. So those 2 boats were both built here. The local papers praised the shipping companies for having faith in the shipyard to construct their steamers. Remember, the Longs were directors of the shipping companies and the shipyard. The wooden steamers were beautiful, but prone to being destroyed by fire. The latest in shipbuilding technology was steel-hulled ships, so the partners brought aboard an expert in that field, Captain Alexander McDougall of Duluth. By a strange coincidence, he had lived in Ottawa, had been a classmate there of John Long, and was happy to accept his old friend's offer. With the launch of Hull Number 1, the Huronic, in 1901 for the Northern Navigation Company, steel shipbuilding had begun in Canada. And there she's steaming out of the harbor. Isn't that a beautiful sight to see a boat like that down there compared to what's there now? Progress. Launch day was a day to remember for the town, and Thomas Long's daughter had the honor of christening the Huronic. Quote, "To Thomas Long and partners, we are indebted for the steel shipbuilding industry on the Great Lakes." Yes, Thomas Long was a family man. He had married Anne Patton in 1861, and they had 14 children, including 2 sets of twins. Sadly, only 5 children reached adulthood. Only 3 survived the parents, and only 2 girls left any descendants. Some years ago, I received an inquiry at the library from a woman in New York who was looking for information on her great-great-great-grandfather. She knew that he was from Ireland, that he had a store in Collingwood, that his name was Thomas Long. Did I have information for her? The library made $50 from what I sent her. This picture is of Thomas' son, Thomas Patrick, always known as TP. This gentleman lived on Pine Street and was a neighbor of Eileen and Muriel's. He looked after the firm's business in town until it was sold in 1928 to form National Grocers. TP was raised in the family home at the corner of First and Maple Street. And there it is. This was always owned by Tom Long. His family lived there, and then when he went elsewhere, his sister, Mrs. Burns, lived there in family, and then John Long lived there. When the house was renovated in 1897, the painter and decorator was Eileen and Muriel's great-grandfather, Mr. W.H. Wensley. His work must have been satisfactory because he was listed as one of the tradesmen who were at the dinner Tom hosted at the reopening of the stores after a disastrous fire in 1905. Not to be outdone, my great-grandfather and grandfather were there also. This lovely home was sold for $4,000 in 1923 after Tom's death. It was demolished in 1936, and the site remained empty until wartime houses were built on it. They are still there. Go and take a look at them, and then remember that's what was there before. Progress? Oh, I think not. Quote, "The building is now turned into one of the finest dwelling places in the province." Thomas Long's father-in-law, Charles Patton, had been a long-time Collingwood councillor, and his brother-in-law, Basil Patton, was our mayor during World War I. Perhaps Tom was influenced by his in-laws because he also served on the town council from 1865 to 1870. In 1875, the new provincial riding of Simcoe West was created, and Tom accepted the nomination of the Conservative Party and won the election by 60 votes. He was re-elected in 1879, and despite being unanimously nominated in 1883, he declined due to ill health. And there's his parliamentary history, which I got off the internet. So he's still on the internet. His political life was not without controversy because he was a Catholic representing a predominantly Protestant Orange Lodge electorate. But the canny voters were well aware that much of the riding's prosperity was due to his efforts, and so felt that he was the best man to represent them. Quote, "His interests are our interests, his prosperity ours also." Catholics were few in number in town. They held services in a tiny chapel on Cedar Street, which they had purchased when the Anglican congregation outgrew it. It was not until 1886 that they had a resident priest. The Long brothers generously donated land on Ontario Street between St. Paul and Elgin Streets for a church, rectory, and school. In 1886, John Long had the rectory built at his own expense, and Thomas contributed very liberally to the building of the church in 1888. And there they are. Fortunately, they're still standing. Tom was honored in 1914 when he was created by the Pope a Knight of the Order of St. Gregory the Great. This decoration was shared by only 6 other eminent Catholic laymen in Canada and the United States. Quote, "Papal decoration conferred on Thomas Long, Collingwood's foremost citizen." Now that we've covered business, politics, and religion, how about amusement? There was no event more eagerly anticipated than the annual fair, and communities vied for the privilege of hosting it. Collingwood, being the largest community, felt it deserved an annual fair, and so the Collingwood Horticultural and Agricultural Society was formed. We still have a horticultural society. In 1882, to sponsor a fair held in the market square behind the town hall. It was a great success, as was the one held the following year. The directors of the society were mainly merchants, and we know how anxious merchants are to lure people to the downtown area. In 1884, a building committee was formed to raise funds to erect a permanent building. After negotiating a deal with the town for a 99-year lease of the town park, a beautiful agricultural building was built. That's it. But it was destroyed by arson in June of the following year. Undaunted, the building committee built an even better building, and the 1885 fair opened in September as scheduled. What had all this to do with Thomas Long? Well, he had often spoken about the advantages of having an annual fair in Collingwood. He was a merchant, remember? He was a director and often president of the Horticultural Society, which sponsored it. He was a director and often president of the building committee. In fact, he contacted Sir John A. Macdonald to open the 1884 fair. Sir John was unable to attend, but the newspapers printed his reply to "My dear Long." How many locals got a letter like that? I like to think that he suggested the name Great Northern Exhibition for the first Collingwood Fair in 1882. After all, he was a director of the Great Northern Transit Company. Why not? At any rate, no one ever came up with a better name because it is still the Great Northern Exhibition. Quote, "The town and surrounding area owe a debt of gratitude to the gentleman who originated the idea of the Great Northern, who put their own money into the buildings and who freely gave their services for the promotion of agriculture." By 1888, Tom had extensive business interests outside Collingwood, so the time had come to move his family from First and Maple to Jarvis Street in Toronto. He bought Sheriff Jarvis' house, Woodlawn, and that's it, and extensively remodeled it. The poor Irish lad had come a long way. The local papers lamented the loss of Mrs. Long and the children, but since Tom had been coming and going to Toronto for years, no one seemed to notice that he didn't actually live here after 1888. Until his death over 30 years later, he was always referred to as a citizen of Collingwood, and I think that is a fine tribute, because most people are called former citizens. Quote, "Mr. Long is so closely identified with Collingwood, where his chief business interests have always been, that we still consider him a citizen of our fair town." Tom's success was due solely to his own efforts. He had little formal education, and so was a strong advocate for lifelong learning. T. Long and Brother always advertised for intelligent boys to join their firm, preferably those who had passed the entrance examinations to high school. In 1901, they gave $20 scholarships to the boy and girl who had the highest marks in the entrance examinations and displayed good conduct in school. These scholarships were a first for Collingwood, and other firms have followed Long's lead right up until the present time. Given this support for education, it is understandable that when the Library Board in 1901 was successful in securing a grant of $12,500 from the Carnegie Foundation to build a free public library, the Long brothers were the only property owners who came forward with an offer to offer a site, and actually they offered a choice between two sites. Quote, Messrs. T. Long and Brother will rest assured that their generosity will be highly appreciated by their fellow townsmen. Here it is, our beautiful Carnegie Library. Actually, for some time, it was referred to as the Carnegie Long Library. Incidentally, Collingwood was the first community in Ontario to apply for a Carnegie grant. The Library Board, in its wisdom, chose the site at 2nd and Maple Streets as their preferred location, rather than the other site, which was sold later to the federal government for the post office location. The library served the community well until 1963, when it was destroyed by an arsonist. Much of its contents and that of the Urn Institute in the basement were lost. A one-story library was built later on the same site. The large brick house east of the library was built by the Long brothers' nephew, M.P. Burns. In 1973, Mr. Burns' widow signed it over to the town for $2, and it was later demolished to make way for library expansion. I think the Long family had done their share in trying to provide library services for Collingwood citizens. Here's the deed whereby Thomas and John Long turned over their property, 2 lots on East Maple Street, to the Library Board for $1. These were not vacant lots, but income-producing property. The tenants were evicted and the houses torn down. Quote, Long's philanthropy materially assisted Collingwood in securing one of the town's leading institutions, the public library. The Longs made only one request, namely, that the property be used only for the site of a free public library. And you can see that typed in there. It was their intention that this property would always be available to the citizens of Collingwood. By inserting this condition, they hope to prevent any future sale of the property for non-library purposes. Enough said about that. Fires have always been the bane of pioneer communities, so it was good news in 1911 when the town decided to build a new fire hall on St. Marie Street behind the town hall. Tom was given the honor of laying the cornerstone. He was now 75 years old and had not lived in town for 23 years, yet he was referred to as a fellow citizen. Even the Barrie Examiner congratulated Collingwood on having a local officiate rather than some out-of-town dignitary. The outpouring of affection so overwhelmed him that he nearly forgot what he had planned to say. But he quickly recovered and said that he had never before felt so surrounded by friends. A dinner was held and all present lauded his accomplishments and what he had done for Collingwood. Mayor Curry said, quote, ever has he been progressive, and the foundations of our most important industries were laid by him. Tom replied to the many kind remarks, quote, since coming to town in 1854, it has been my aim, pleasure, and desire to do all in my power to further the interests of Collingwood. And, quote, if opportunity offered where I could be of any assistance whatever to the citizens of Collingwood, I would always be willing to lend a helping hand. That opportunity arrived the next year when he was called upon to lend a helping hand. This time it was the hospital that needed assistance. A nurses' training school had been established in 1898, but the young ladies had to live and take classes in the hospital, So the hospital board contacted Tom to request funds to construct a nurse's residence. Why contact Tom? Back in 1883, when the idea of a hospital was first proposed, a ladies' hospital committee composed of 4 local women from 4 different religious persuasions was formed. These 4 women could rightly be called the founders of the hospital. They were Mrs. Lett, Mrs. Carpenter, Miss Frame, and Mrs. Thomas Long. Yes, the hospital was Anne Long's cause. She had furnished one of the 4 wards, and until her death in 1901, remained vitally interested. 2 of the women had personal reasons to support hospital services. Jessie Carpenter had lost 5 of her 9 children in early childhood, and Anne Long had lost 9 of her 14. Thomas Long agreed to build the Anne Long Memorial Nurses' Home. Indeed, a fine remembrance of a lovely lady. The public were asked to furnish it, and he furnished the reception room. Tom, at age 77, proudly laid the cornerstone in 1913. This fine building served the nurse trainees until 1956, when the training school was terminated. The building was later demolished to make way for hospital expansion. Quote, "There is a deep sense of gratitude to Mr. Long from his old hometown for such a magnificent gift. It is a credit to him and to the honor of a noble and beloved woman." Ironically, in 1920, when his nephew, M.P. Burns, was unveiling a plaque in the hospital in memory of Anne Long, word was received of Tom's imminent death. The newspaper heading said it all. Collingwood's grand old man is gathered to his fathers. The papers waxed eloquently with tributes. Quote, "When Thomas Long passed away, much of Collingwood's prestige in the industrial, commercial, and political world passed with him." Quote, "In the way of public benefactions, the town owes him much. The sites for the public library, St. Mary's Church, and the Anne Long Nurses' Home are outstanding examples of his generosity." Quote, "Few men knew Collingwood and its possibilities better than Mr. Long, and his efforts throughout life were to advance its material and moral prosperity." The flags flew at half-mast. St. Mary's Church was filled to capacity for the funeral. The bell he had donated so long ago, and which bore the inscription, "Well done, good and faithful servant," tolled mournfully as the cortege wended its way to the cemetery. Thomas Long had returned to Collingwood. I have relied heavily on newspaper quotes in order to show his position in the minds and hearts of his fellow citizens. I would like to share one last quote from an editorial on the front page of the Collingwood Messenger, August the 28th, 1909, in part. "And looking back over 40 years, we know that Thomas Long is a faithful friend, energetic, zealous, hewing straight to the line, of strong personal characteristics. He is a force in the business world of the province, and a man we are distinctly proud of. May his shadow never grow less." And now I submit that his shadow has been extinguished, and he is indeed Collingwood's forgotten man. What do you think?
What a success story. And it all looks so easy, Marie, but I know it was many, many hours of work and research, and don't we appreciate it? Yeah. And also the help that Susan She is a real asset to our historical society, and I would like to, in appreciation, give you that tonight. And Susan, would you come up?
And thanks again, Susan.
Oh, you're welcome.
Are there any questions or comments? Well, I'm certainly sure that Marie will be available at the end of the meeting if you wish to discuss the topic with her further. I want to add my personal thanks, Marie, because you've answered the questions effectively that... Mike. Oh, sorry. I forget about that. I'd like to add my personal thanks to that of Eileen and the group, Marie, because you've answered so very effectively the question that I kept getting day after day after day when we first put out our posters about this meeting, which was, who's Thomas Long? Over and over and over again. So that was the answer that you gave so very effectively. Certainly a man of many talents and a man of great ability, and I think this may be the start of a revival, that we indeed are not going to have Thomas Long, the forgotten man. Certainly the people here this evening will remember him as a giant in Collingwood's past. Thank you very much.
I've got here a handout if anybody's interested. Susan printed these up. I spoke to the Rotary Club many years ago about Thomas and John Long's involvement in all sorts of business ventures in Collingwood and elsewhere. And so Susan printed that up if anybody wants to take that. Also, the box here is T. Long and Brother Limited grocers on it, and this was given to me by a lady in Ottawa when she first heard that I was talking about him many years ago, and she had had that for years, and she wanted to know if I wanted it. Well, I have treasured it ever since. It's great. And Carol Bowden brought the jug here with T. Long and Brother on it. She says she can't get the flowers out, but the jug is good. The picture was painted by my husband some years ago, and it was donated to the library. This was when the library was still at the site where Thomas Long wanted it to be. Susan brought the picture down here. It sort of bothers me to see it. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
For the last several years, the January meeting of the Collingwood District Historical Society has been the occasion to announce its program of meetings and activities for the coming year. And I would now like to distribute copies of that program to you and take a minute or two to review it.
Yeah.